Hi everybody, welcome back to Think Outside the Board. I'm your host Brian Toohey, and today we're doing a first impressions video on Red Rising, the latest title from Stonemaier Games. Now, Red Rising is a medium light game for 1 to 6 players. It can be played solo. It's also based on a series of novels, so it brings over the theme from the series of novels. So if you really like the game, you can go read the books. And I know that Jamey Stegmaier, one of the designers, is a huge fan of the books, which is why he wanted to make the game, which makes sense. It is published by Stonemaier Games. Stonemaier Games you probably know as the publisher of, well, Charterstone, Euphoria, Build a Better Dystopia, Scythe, Tapestry, and Viticulture. Those are all games that Jamey Stegmaier himself designed. And they've also published Wingspan, Between Two Cities, Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig, which is sort of a hybrid game of Between Two Cities and the Castles of Mad King Ludwig that those two companies collaborated on together. They've also put out My Little Scythe, which is sort of a junior version of Scythe, and Pendulum, which was not a Stonemaier design, just like Wingspan wasn't. So Jamey did co-design this one along with Alexander Schmidt. This appears to be his first published game. And then there's a team of 3 artists on this game. First up is Jackie Davis, who's worked quite a bit. She's worked on Colosseum, Cubitos, Ex Libris, Euphoria, Build a Better, Dystopia, Stockpile, Viticulture, and the Viticulture Essential Edition. And she's joined by Miles Bensky and Justin Wong. And again, this appears to be the first published game for both of them. Now, Red Rising is a card game where you are essentially curating a hand of cards. So you're going to start the game with 5 cards in your hand. You're trying to get as many cards in your hand as you can by the end of the game, although once you get more than 7 cards, you'll start getting some penalties, but you can get more. If those cards are scoring more than 10 points, it's still to your advantage to have them in your hand. And it takes the gameplay of a game called Fantasy Realms, which I really, really like, and it adds on a few other things. So let me show you how the game plays, and then once I've done that, I'll tell you what I think about it. So first I just wanted to show you this groovy little box and insert. This is the collector's edition. So you've got the metal cubes and player markers over here, each of them in their own little area. You've got spots here for your die, the Apollo marker, which is also the first player marker, the Sovereign token, this little guy with the little helium gems in here, and then you've got spots for the cards and the little player boards and things. They also included these trays that you can kind of lay out your cards in, so you can have a little tableau in front of you. I didn't like these. I would not use these. This is my one kind of problem with the game component-wise. My fiance Kristen and I, both of us, when we had our cards up here, we would hit the cards and the whole thing would kind of knock over. And part of the problem is that as long as this tray is, I don't think it's really long enough to fit all 5 cards. Definitely if you get a bigger hand, like 7 or 8 cards, there's going to be overlap between the cards. So they're all kind of going to be like interlocked together, which means if you knock one, they're going to push the whole, it'll be like one piece and they'll just kind of tip the whole thing over and everyone will see your cards and you'll lose your cards. And that happened multiple times to each of us. So we're just never going to use these. I think they needed to be weighted more heavily or just made differently. But that's my only problem with the components. So when you're setting up this game, you're going to put 2 cards in every one of these 4 columns. Players will put their little player markers over here on the fleet track. Every player will randomly have one of these player boards, which will give you a little player power, and you'll have 10 cubes that you'll start with. You'll also have a starting hand of 5 cards. And then the rest of the cards will go here. And you'll have your helium right here. Now, essentially what you're doing in this game is you're trying to get a hand of cards that will score the most points. And all of these cards have points on them. So this one's 15, 16, 18, 15, 15. But they also have these scoring conditions on the bottom, and they're all different. This one wants to be with another specific card. So you need to have that card and you're going to get another 15 points. This one, if this is your only obsidian colored card, you're going to get another 15 points. So that'll make each one of these worth 30 instead of 15. Here's one that says, if with Pelamanus or the Pax, you'll get 10 points. And then you'll gain points equal to your position on the fleet track, 0 to 10. So you're going to score 2 different possible conditions there. This is the Diplomat. He'll score 16 points. But at the end of the game, if you and any opponent have the exact same amount of influence on the Institute, you'll score an additional 19 points. So you're going to want to tie with somebody. Anyway, my point here is that all of these cards are going to score you points, and they can all score you more points depending on the other cards that you have in your hand and a few other conditions. So your job is to curate or put together a hand of cards that's going to score you the most points. Now, on your turn, you are going to do one of 2 actions. The first action, you're going to take one of your cards and you're going to place it in one of these 4 columns. And when you do that, you're going to get to activate the power on it. The powers don't always work depending on where you're putting it. It might be something that you kind of need to set up or arrange. It may work off of certain board game situations. So you'll be waiting some time for the right time to place certain cards to really maximize their power. After you've placed it in a column, you're then going to draw a card from one of the other columns. So if I placed it here on Jupiter, which is the fleet track column, I would have to take from either one of these 3 columns or the deck. If I take from Mars, I'm going to get a Helium. If I take from Luna, I'm going to get the Sovereign marker. And the Sovereign marker usually will activate a player ability. So if you're playing the green color, Diana, whenever you get this marker, you're going to be able to place an influence cube up here in this influence area. And if you take your card from the Institute, you're going to get to place an influence cube up there. Lastly, you can draw a card from the deck. If you do that, you're going to get to roll this die. You might get Helium, you might get the Sovereign marker, you might go up on the fleet track, you might get to place an influence cube. So all of these are looking familiar. But you may be also able to banish a card, or you may be able to take a card from the deck and place it somewhere without actually activating that deploy ability on it. That's the ability that allows you to use the card's power. So that's the first thing that you can do on your turn. The other thing that you could do, if you're satisfied with what you already have in your hand, if you've kind of set yourself up well and you don't want to lose a card and nothing that's available looks particularly good to you, then you can take a card from here, choose a place to play it. You'll get the bonus of that column, but you won't get to activate the power. So it's a way to kind of tread water. You'll get a little something, you'll get the little kind of extra thing, but you won't have to lose a card from your hand to do it. And since this is the only one that I didn't explain previously, if you're doing it this way, when you place on Jupiter, you go up the fleet track. And that's the same thing that would happen if you removed a card from here during the first action. So you're just doing one of those 2 things. You're either playing a card and taking a card and getting the little kind of extra thing with the taking of the card, or you're peeling off a card and you're placing it somewhere and performing the little extra mechanic. So that's the whole game. It's really all about curating these cards, trying to get the most points. At the end of the game, you'll score points for that. You'll also score points for wherever you are in the fleet track. You'll score 3 points per Helium cube that you have. If you have the Sovereign token, you'll score 10 points. And you'll score points for influence. If you have the most influence cubes, you'll score 4 points for cubes. If you score second most, you'll score 2 points for cubes. If you have the third highest number of cubes, you'll score 1 point per cube that's up here. If you have more than 7 cards in your hand at the very end, you will also take a 10-point penalty for each of those cards over 7 cards. But it's pretty simple, it's pretty easy. That's everything that's going on in the board and in the game. And it's really just Fantasy Realms with a bunch of other little things on it. Okay, so this is a first impressions video. It's not a full teacher review. I'm not sure if I will end up doing a full teacher review because I've played the game 4 times. I've played a couple of 2-player games and a couple of solo games. And I think I have a really good handle on the game. I'm excited to play with more players and see how it plays. But I don't think that there's anything that I don't understand about the game. It is a lighter game. I've played it a handful of times already, and everything about it makes sense to me. So in Fantasy Realms, the game that it is so much like that Jamey Stegmaier even mentioned it in the rulebook. In Fantasy Realms, you have a bunch of cards, and you are there's scoring conditions on all of these cards, and you're trying to get the scoring conditions to be fulfilled in the best way possible and to not conflict with other scoring conditions in your hand. So this is still Fantasy Realms I'm talking about. So you're going to get a card in Fantasy Realms, and you're going to take a card or discard a card, and you're just trying to get this hand to synergize really well and score endgame points. They even have an app for that where you can kind of just plug in your cards at the end of the game, and it'll tell you what the score is and calculate all of the varying conditions for you. So Red Rising is very much like that, but it adds in a few more things, as you saw on the board. You've got those different mechanics that you're going to activate when you're taking a card back. You might be taking Helium, which will score points at the end of the game. You might be moving up that fleet track, which will also score points at the end of the game. You might be putting influence cubes in that influence area for an area majority scoring at the end of the game. Or you may be rolling that die for some random stuff. Or you may be taking that token and then activating your player ability, which will usually get you one of the other things. So you're doing the same thing that you're doing in Fantasy Realms, where you're trying to assemble this hand of cards that's going to score well together. But you've got all these other little things that you can kind of fiddle with as well. And they score some significant points. If you get high up on that fleet track, you're going to score a lot of points. I think you can score 40 points for the influence cubes if you get all of your 10 cubes on there. And then you may have other cards that are going to score off of those influence cubes as well. And you've got the Helium, and then you've got the card that kind of draw deck in the middle with the dice. So I like that. I like the fact that not only are you doing the kind of card curation, but you're also triggering all these other things, and they can get you points as well. I think that gives you more variability in the game. In fact, you could get hit with a pretty crummy hand of cards and maybe still kind of save things for yourself somewhat, depending on how you're playing with those other mechanics. Now, I don't think it's necessary for anyone to have both Fantasy Realms and Red Rising. I think they really do scratch that same itch. And I think players may tend to prefer one over the other. For me, I don't really. I like them both. I think they both do really, really well what they're trying to do. Red Rising just adds in a few more things. Maybe you're the kind of person who really likes those few more things, and so Red Rising is the game for you. Maybe you're the kind of person like my fiance, Kristen, who thinks that all those things add in a lot of extra fiddliness that don't need to be there and can be confusing at times. I think she would probably like the more kind of pared back, scaled back gameplay of Fantasy Realms where you're just curating that hand. My point, though, isn't that Fantasy Realms is better or Fantasy Realms is worse. It's that they're both really, really good games that I find very fun and very engaging and have compelling choices. And if you offer me to play either one of those games, I'll play them at the drop of a hat because they're easy to pick up, they're easy to teach, they have choices that I like, and you can play it fairly quickly. Now, the one negative that I'd like to mention about Red Rising that I think people should know about is the card colors. So you've got a lot of card colors in this game, perhaps too many card colors, and perhaps too many card colors that don't really work well with each other because some of them are too similar. So for instance, you've got not only gold cards, but you've got bronze cards, and you've got yellow cards, and you've got gold, silver, and gray. And if you throw in, if you happen to be colorblind and you throw that into the mix, that could be confusing as well. I wonder if they maybe could have found some different colors that were a little further apart from each other. But the fact of the matter is that there's so many different colored cards in the game, I don't know if that would have been possible. Now, it doesn't bother me. I'm fine with it. But for some people, it could be a real problem. Again, my fiancée, Kristen, didn't really like the fact that some of those colors were confusingly, almost dangerously close to each other in color. So it's just something to be aware. If that's going to bother you, again, Fantasy Realms might be the better choice. Because I think, if I remember correctly, I think in that game, I haven't played it since pre-pandemic, but I think in that game the colors are a little less confusing and maybe a little less diverse to the point that they have to and when I say diverse, I mean that there's so many different colors, they have to include colors that are close to each other. So I think Fantasy Realms has fewer colors, and then there's less confusion about colors that might look like each other. But either way, both games are really good, I think for me, for Red Rising, for a lighter game like that, which isn't usually so much my thing, where I really like these choices, I think I'm going to put the game at about an 8.5. Now, I'm not expecting to do a full teaching review anytime soon because the game's pretty easy to explain. I think in this first impressions video, you saw everything that you need to see. If, however, people want a full teaching review, let me know in the comments and I will produce that at some point when I get the time to do it. For me, it's just a really fun, little compelling game that's very easy and quick to get to the table, plays up to 6 players. You can play it solo, and I've played it solo twice, and I don't think it suffers at all. You know, some games you try to play the solo version and it feels almost like work because you're having to do too many things to make up for mechanisms in the multiplayer game that aren't in the solo game to kind of adjust for that. And it's too much bookkeeping and the fun ends up going out the window. And I don't mind bookkeeping, but sometimes in those solo types of versions, the bookkeeping can come at the expense of the game. I don't feel like that's at all the case with Red Rising. I think that it is a joy to play. So it's going to get an 8.5 for me, and I'm kind of assuming that that point score is going to stand for quite some time. If you don't like lighter games, it may not be the game for you. But it's a really good game that I think should appeal to most gamers, as long as when you're looking at it, the central mechanic there of trying to put that card hand together so that it works really well with itself. If you find that interesting and compelling, you're going to like this game. And I think it does what it does very, very well. So until next time, this has been a first impressions video from Think Outside the Board with me, your host, Brian Tuohy. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you soon in my next video, a first impressions video for Maglev Metro, coming soon.